One of the things I absolutely love about being on this channel is the interaction with you guys, our viewers. You're fantastic with all your comments and lovely expressions of support and so on. So today I thought we'd do something a little bit different. I've been asking for your questions and we're going to potter around the garden today and I'm going to try and answer as many of them as I can. Richard from Ile-de-France and Beverly from Utah both ask, why are my cucumbers tasting bitter? Richard's were tasty initially and now taste bitter, and he mentions that in his tunnel it gets very, very hot. Well, the compound responsible for bitterness is called cucurbitacin, and it's usually found in the stems, leaves and roots of the cucumber, but it can migrate to the fruit when it's really, really hot or because of irregular watering and severe temperature fluctuations. We've had quite a hot summer and I suspect it's been as hot in France and Utah as it has here. So what's happened probably is that the fruit has got increasingly bitter with the increase in temperature. The solution is to try and get good airflow and to water consistently so your cucumbers are never left wanting for moisture, and mulch around them as well to keep that moisture locked in. In future, keep a lookout for varieties called burpless varieties that are specifically bred to be less bitter tasting because they produce less cucurbitacin. And here's a little tip, Richard and Beverly, that you might find appealing, is to peel your cucumber, especially at the stem end, because that's where it tends to be the most bitter. Corey from New Jersey asks, what should I do with my spinach bolts? Should I cut it down to ground level or can I harvest the leaves? Well, this is my chard, a kind of relative of the spinach, and you can see it's bolted, but the leaves are still perfectly edible and have none of the bitterness that you might get from, say, lettuce that has bolted. So my advice is to keep picking those leaves from the spinach even when it's bolted, but you will get to a stage where it's just flowering so much and the leaves get progressively smaller that you'll just have to call it a day and lift it up and re-sow. Remember, spinach grows really quickly, so it's always worth keep on sowing every 2 or 3 weeks to get a succession of lovely leaves before they bolt. Esther has a question about water management. She asks, am I hosepipe free to water my vegetables? While Joe from Yorkshire has a similar question, how do I cope during a hosepipe ban? Well, my system is quite straightforward. I fill up my water butts here with a hosepipe connected to the mains water, if there isn't enough rain that is, and then I just dip in my watering cans and then water using them. Now the logic here is the flow from a watering can is a lot faster than from a hosepipe. We're actually going to get a hosepipe ban on Tuesday, and for those that aren't familiar with what that means, it means I can't use a hosepipe anymore. However, do check locally, because in my water region I actually can if I'm going to water my vegetables. So just read up and see what the rules are in your area. But if you absolutely can't use your hosepipe, then just go back to the good old things like mulching and watering really deeply. And yes, it will take a bit more time, but prioritise your water for the thirstiest plants. And I find that whenever there's a hosepipe ban, well, that's when the rain finally starts. Tristan from New Hampshire has just got a greenhouse and asked, what should he grow in the greenhouse and what should he avoid? Firstly, Tristan, congratulations. A greenhouse will definitely increase your growing season and give you a lot of options. It's a lot of fun. Now in mine, I tend to concentrate on warm season crops that like it nice and warm, of course, and that are high value. So things like tomatoes here, peppers, both sweet and chili. I've got melons there, some lovely basil, anything like that, eggplant or aubergine. You want things that are going to really bask in that heat that you can't grow so easily outside. Now, the things that you can't grow, I would say in the heat of summer, things like most salads like lettuce and maybe spinach and so on, a lot of kind of cool season crops like brassicas might struggle, especially if it isn't very well shaded. They might get a bit of sunburn as well. It's really useful in the greenhouse to start off seedlings and so on and cuttings early on in the year, so I think you'll find it a huge resource. Matthew from the UK asks, do you worry about plastics in your soil? I'm always finding bits when I'm digging. Well, Matthew, I have the same issue here, and I've just scratched around this little bit here between these parsnips and found 2 little bits of plastic, something hard and a bit of bag it looks like there. Now, this stuff has come from the council, from municipal garden waste, and I think there's a lot of impurities that get into it from that. My advice is to not sweat it too much. There's plastics everywhere, unfortunately, and we can do other things to avoid plastics in our diet by not microwaving in plastic bowls, for example. But in the garden, I think the best way to avoid plastics is to make your own compost. I like to make as much of my own compost as I can. And for anyone that wants to get started with making compost and doesn't quite know where to start, I'll link to our video on that in the description. Lauren asks, should I support my asparagus ferns or just let them droop? It won't be until next year that I can take a harvest. Well, Lauren, I don't bother here. They kind of stand up as they are, but if they do flop over and they're covering surrounding crops, then you can always stick in a stake and just gather all the fronds together and tie them to keep them together. But if they're not causing an issue, just let them droop. Danny from steamy Savannah in Georgia is growing peas and beans along with other things, but he struggles with his peas and beans because they wilt in the heat, even when he sows them in kind of late fall. So he asks, are there any alternatives that can cope with the heat? Well, yes, there are. Southern peas or cowpeas are your go-to, and things like Crowder peas or black-eyed peas are examples of those. They're both really drought tolerant and, more importantly, can cope with the heat. In fact, they thrive on it. As for beans, you could go for asparagus beans or yard-long beans. Olga asks, how can I avoid blossom end rot? Olga, this is quite a common problem with tomatoes, and actually you can see here, somewhat embarrassingly, they've happened to mine as well. Now, part of this is a lack of calcium, but it's not lack of calcium in the soil, it's probably intermittent, irregular watering that causes these issues. If you look over here, these tomatoes of a different variety are absolutely fine. So one thing you can do is look out for varieties described as resisting blossom end rot. But what I need to do now is I need to get on and feed these with a proper tomato feed. I've been growing them in this potting mix here, and I thought there were enough nutrients for now, but clearly there aren't. So I'm going to go in, feed them regularly with the tomato feed. That should give them enough nutrients. I'm going to feed them and water them more frequently as well for more consistency, and this problem should disappear. Look at these beautiful stripy cinnabar moths on this ragwort here. They're just beautiful, aren't they? But Shal from Canada asks, have you got any tips for getting over touching bugs? I get super squeamish, especially with earwigs. Well, Shal, I had exactly the same thing with spiders. I'm still a little bit arachnophobic, but I used to really flip out when one ran over my hand when I had them in the potting mix, for example. But gradual exposure has got me more used to them. In fact, bugs like these cinnabar moths and many of the little bugs we see in our garden are so good for the ecosystem, and it's the sign of a garden that's alive and healthy. They're so important for just pollination and keeping our crops healthy. And when I think of all the good things they do, well, it fills me with wonder. So I just say, just spend time with them, don't worry too much, just think of all the goodness they do, and I promise with time you'll actually get to love them. Andrew from Essex says, we're really suffering from the hot weather and lack of rain. What are your tips for greenhouse growing in hot summers? Even my chilies are suffering. Well, Andrew, I feel your pain. I much prefer it when it's cool and damp, so I've really not enjoyed this summer. But my tips for greenhouse growing are to, well, of course, open all doors and windows to get a good through flow of air. You can also put shading up. I'd recommend putting it on the outside. Netting is good because it's just throw it over and it casts a nice bit of shade, or you can paint on shade paint, of course. I've also heard that covering windows in yogurt can help to greatly reduce the solar insulation. Another tip is to splosh water on any hard surface in your greenhouse. Now, this won't cool things down, it'll make it quite steamy, but it'll help your plants to better cope with that heat. And if it's really hot, well, hopefully you can move things like chilies outside if they're in pots and just let them bask outside. And of course, make sure that your plants are kept consistently watered. And if you can put down some sort of mulch over the surface of the potting mix or soil, then you're onto a winner. Lysan from Belgium, Autumn from Illinois, and Jimmy from Leicestershire are all asking broadly the same question. What can I do now to prepare for winter? What can I be sowing and planting to keep the party going? Well, guys, I think that there are lots of things you can plant and sow now. For sowing, there's still time to sow things like kale, spinach, as well as kind of winter hardy salads like lettuce and rocket or arugula and so on. For planting, if you can find them, then get in there with plug plants of things like these leeks here, as well as sprouting broccoli. Something else I like to try later in summer to give me a crop and kind of autumn time is second cropping potatoes. I've got them growing in my buckets over here, and I'll make a planting about now with some new tubers to give me a crop later on in the season. And then as autumn progresses, you can get on and sow things like fava or broad beans and garlic to enjoy next spring and summer. Samuel from Norway asks, is there a way to make worm castings on the ground without having to sort of buy in any worms to get it all started? He doesn't want to have any external inputs, he just wants to get on with it. Well, yes, there is, but first of all, let me tell you about worm castings. They're just the kind of product of worms, the kind of poo, if you like, and they're full of really, really good stuff, supercharged with nutrients, and they're so good for your plants. When I went to see Charles Dowding's garden, he had a little setup just on the ground, like you explained, with half decomposed material and kitchen scraps that were then covered with a tarpaulin. And in there was a writhing mass of wriggly red even worms that help with that composting process. And he used these worm castings to then help make his own potting mix. It's really lovely stuff. I'll link to that video down below so you can have a look, but the worms will generally find their own way in. It's like when you start a compost heap, so you can, over time, just have this going on the ground with no external inputs. Joe from Stockport asks, do you have any advice for keeping Rosie, this dog here, out of your beds? I've got a Chihuahua that digs up my lettuce and keeps pinching my strawberries. Joe, I feel your pain. I have Rosie here nicking my leeks. That's the only thing she seems to nick. But I just put this kind of thing up here to keep her away from the plants I'm trying to protect. My big nemesis here is pigeons. Rosie is the least of my problems, but just covering things is the only solution, to be honest with you. Rosie in northern Scotland, what a lovely place to be, is asking if there's a fruit that can bridge the gap between gooseberries and apples. Now, she grows quite a lot of her fruit. She's got rhubarb and strawberries in the polytunnels from about May, and then she has her gooseberries in July, and then it's her blueberries and apples, I think she said, in August, but there's a gap in between. Well, I reckon, Rosie, that currants is what you're looking for. These are my white currants here, and these are a perfect bridge. They crop about 2 to 3 weeks after my gooseberry bush just here, and they're before my apples, so I think that's what you're missing. Black currants are my absolute favourite. I made a lovely cordial with them, but I also grow red currants and these white currants, and I think, well, you're onto a winner with these. Mich Lardo from Belgium has a question about seeds. He says that you can save heirloom seeds year after year and keep things going, but if you try and save F1 seeds, F1 hybrid seeds, well, you'll get pretty poor results the next spring. Why is that? Well, Mich Lardo, it's because the F1 hybrids are artificially bred by having 2 separate parents in controlled settings. So you need both the parents to produce the F1 hybrid. That F1 hybrid seed you produce won't be stable, if you like. It will revert back to one or more of the parents or get confused somewhere in the middle and give very unpredictable results. Whereas heirloom seeds, there's just one parent. It produces the seeds, grows a new plant and carries on, just like my beautiful parsnips here. Kate has a problem with mildew. Join the club, Kate. She says, how can I avoid it and what can I do to deal with it once I do actually have it? Well, Kate, here are some of my zucchini or courgettes here which have mildew, this kind of powdery fungal disease. It slows down how effective this can photosynthesize and slows the plant down. Now, it's quite common on older leaves, so the simplest solution is just to cut off the worst affected leaves and then leave the younger ones, like these here at the middle here, to kind of grow on and replace them. In this instance here, I've cut off the worst affected ones and then tied it to a stake to raise it off the ground. Now, the theory behind this, as well as saving space, is that it will improve airflow. Airflow is really important in helping to avoid mildew, as is keeping the soil nice and consistently moist. It's dry soil that's a big problem. So improve airflow and keep things nice and moist. Aileen from South Central Alaska has a problem with her onions. Now, she's had her leaves go kind of yellow and floppy and stunted, And when she's cut open an onion, she's found little yellowy cream maggots with a little black dot at one end, and they're causing issues. Well, I think you've almost certainly got onion maggot, which is the kind of grub of the onion fly. Now this pest lays its eggs in kind of like late spring at the neck of the onion there, and then gets in and feeds on the bulb and the roots, severely stunting growth. There's not much you can do about it now, but for future I would try and encourage natural predators such as little ground beetles and birds, and I would certainly consider covering my crop and growing it in a new place. So covering it with something like an insect mesh or fleece to stop the little flies finding your onions in the first place. But now you've got the problem, I would definitely grow your onions in a new position next year. Bloodfish and bone meal is one of my favourite general purpose organic fertilisers, but Jane from southwest Germany says, you're often mentioning this, but I want to avoid products with blood in for religious reasons. Can you suggest an alternative? Well, Jane, yes I can. Alfalfa meal is a great alternative for blood meal, which is quite high in nitrogen, so that's great for leafy crops. Things like comfrey pellets have got a good broad spectrum of nutrients, so they'd be perfect. And then you've got seaweed feed as well. That's a fantastic all-purpose general fertiliser that really helps crops. But you can also often find just an organic all-purpose fertiliser that is also vegan and has no animal products whatsoever. There are a few brands around, so just give it a Google and see what's available in your country. Well, it's been lovely answering your questions, and I'm very lucky to have such a warm and friendly community such as you guys. Thank you for being a part of our channel. I really appreciate it. And I will catch you next time.